is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. Tonight we have a unique show. Eric LaMontagne is with us, who usually is sitting over there as a co-host and co-producer, but tonight Eric is a guest.
I know, I'm a little nervous being on this side. Get to see how the other half feels.
Yeah, you asked for the questions. I said, guests don't get the questions, Eric. They just get to answer them. But, and I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about yourself, so people don't, all they know is you here, but you have another life outside of this studio, correct?
Yeah, well, somewhat. So as Pat mentioned, I'm the, or as you mentioned, I forget it, this isn't a third person.
Yeah, right.
I'm still in interviewer mode here. Well, as you mentioned, yeah, I'm the took the executive director role at Campaign for Vermont about 1.5 to 2 years ago now. Previous to that, I spent 7 years in the water quality advocacy world, which was a whole. I helped organize fundraising events and did a lot of communications work with the issues surrounding there. So I am a born and raised Vermonter. I never lived a day anywhere else, actually. I recently got accused on Campaign for Vermont's Facebook page for sounding like a Flatlander and a transplant.
You're hanging around me too long.
Apparently, I said, nope, I bleed green for sure. So I've just been really enjoying this role, getting to help work and try to solve some of these issues that the state has in a place that I really do love.
That's great. But we should do a show, speaking of Lake Champlain, we should do a show on the water quality, because hasn't that been around for 8-10 years, if not longer?
Yeah, and they did just pass a funding bill for it, which is
the cloud.
It's that, but it's taking money from the ed fund, and it's kind of seems like it's one of those issues where they knew they had to do something, so they just did something. It's a very very odd plan.
The ed fund is, well, anyway, let's talk about why you're here. We'll get started on another whole issue. So recently, you put out a editorial or commentary, whatever, and the headline was "Vermont is in trouble." And haven't you caused a little stir? Just for clarification, I edited it. I can't keep quiet, so I put in my 2 cents. But Eric is the author, and for some reason, mainly because I posted it on my Facebook, but it's in the article, if they read it closely, that you wrote it. But somehow I've gotten.
Well, Pat, for those who don't know, Pat is the board president for Campaign for Vermont. So she did get a chance to see this thing ahead of time, and I haven't gotten any angry emails from her saying, "But why are you sending people to my doorstep yet?" But
no, but I want you to talk about this. Talk about the article first of all. But that article in itself has gotten so far today. I looked when I left, about 40 shares. And that has never happened of anything I've ever posted. It's gotten people have shared it.
And that's on your personal page.
Right.
It's up to 14,000 reads and 150 comments, over 100 shares. So
That's
I think people are, seeing some of these numbers we're putting out there and are a little surprised, a little shocked.
I think we should jump in. I hope people have read the article. If not, we're going to kind of go through the article and find out why you said what you did. And we've even had compliments, I will say, from all parties, that it's a really good article, and they've thanked us for it. Asked some questions, challenged it a little bit, but you provide, what I was concerned about the article, there's a lot of statistics. And I don't know about most people, but I sort of do the deer in headlight when I read statistics and wind up having to read them more than once.
Yeah, it's certainly an issue that is not nearly as fun and exciting as some of these more hot button issues that the state is addressing right now. But it is equally as important. The numbers that are presented in this article should be carried with and treated with as much gravity and importance as any of these other issues that we're working on.
I agree.
So
could you start first with where did you get this information? Because
it's
at the end of the article, and I think people need to know this. These are valid numbers. they can be
Yes.
proven. So,
Yeah, so the numbers that are in this article refer to several different sources. So Campaign for Vermont relies on data. When we put out a position, when we put out a statement, it's driven by data. We always welcome people to refute our data.
Right.
We're always open to having that discussion, but we never put something out that isn't data. So the numbers that we're going to discuss here shortly are all based off of several sources. Many of them are numbers coming right out of the state itself. So these are the financial statistics that are coming right from the state of Vermont. Many of the article, or many of much of the information, many of the data points were taken from an organization called the American Enterprise Institute. A lot of people have accused us of right-wing think tank,
right.
using date cherry picking. I think one person verbatim accused us. He wrote a post. This is just right-wing think tank propaganda cherry picking. Hello, goodbye, or hello, unfollow button, goodbye,
Right.
something like
Bye-bye.
that. And but when you actually look at the sources, that AEI is a nonpartisan
Right.
organization. It
Right.
has no political affiliation, no institutional position, doesn't accept any money from any political institution. So it's just raw, unbiased data. To editorialize a little bit, unfortunately, what we're seeing is often when people don't like the data, they tend to accuse it of being
Right.
false without
Right.
trying to find the meaning. And then other bits of the information comes from folks who are prominent registered Democrats.
Yeah.
People who have been working in this arena for years and who are known prominent registered Democrats.
Right. Excellent. So can you, I don't know how you can do this, but can you summarize, other than Vermont's in trouble, can you summarize what this article is about? We're going to kind of, speaking of cherry picking,
Yes.
we're going to talk about the individual components, but how can you summarize what
Yeah,
you
we've been
wrote about?
teasing people here
Yeah.
for a few
Yeah,
minutes with all
What
these
are they talking
intros
about?
and disclaimers. So the article, as I said, it cites information from several different sources, but a primary message in it comes from that American Enterprise Institute's report, financial report on the state of Vermont that came out in April of 2019,
Oh.
April of this year. So it's fairly new data. And in it, it looks at both the changes between 2007 and, I believe it's 2007. Let me just double check. The changes between 1998 and 2017.
Okay.
What the changes in total compensation, so total compensation being the value of wages and the value of benefits, for both the private sector and the public sector. And then it looks at those numbers as it applies to the state, but it also looks at those numbers in context of the entire country. And what we found out was that Vermont, for total compensation, ranked 49th. 49th.
Right. On
Only
all these.
only Montana. And let me clarify that. For private sector wages
Right.
was 49th.
Right.
So we only beat Montana, and not by a whole heck of a lot.
Wow.
So for private sector wages, 49th in the country. Public sector wages were 33rd. So the public sector, so your state employees, your
Right.
teachers, they're doing better than the private sector for sure, but still 33rd. That's the bottom half
Right,
of the country.
That's quite a statement to make. I'm anxious to hear the response from folks that the public sector is doing better than the private sector.
And well,
And that's including benefits, which I think is probably where that difference is.
and that's where a lot of the difference absolutely
Yes,
came
the
from.
benefits.
So whereas in that 20-year period of time, the value of the benefits for the private sector increased. I'm gonna look at the exact numbers here, Pat. So in that same period of time, the value of the benefits for the private sector increased 50.78%.
Wow.
For the public sector, that number was 169%.
Wow.
So the value of the benefits for the private sector is drastically lagging the benefits afforded to those in the public sector. And actually, when it comes to wages, over the last 20 years, so or between 98 and 2007, those private sector wages have actually decreased. So in general, people are making less money now than they were in 1998 if you were in the same role,
Right.
doing the same responsibilities at the same level, you'd be making less money now than you were back then, by a percentage and a half.
Wow.
And then that number for the public sector is 44%. So 44% increase in wage growth in that period of time. So overall, those translate to some really large real-world numbers. So when we're talking about wage changes in the private sector, it's a decrease of 407,000, with an overall increase of $7,500 for those wages and
Really?
benefits total. And that number for the public sector is an increase for the wages. It would be an increase of about $2,800 for cash for the wages, but the value of the value of the benefits package in that time is increased. I have the number right here. Sorry, it is 20,318.
It's hard to have a conversation about this because that's pretty staggering.
And
I'm trying to figure out why.
deliberately kind of trying to vomit numbers at you because I want to, it is illuminate the complexity of this problem.
Right. And why it's, I don't want to say hidden, but why it's not out there. And this is the first time it's been out there with clarity that we are, the private sectors, public sector is a little higher than the private sector, but overall we're low.
Well, and that should be the biggest takeaway, where it is clear that the public sector is doing a little bit better about taking care of themselves.
Right.
Really what should be most alarming is that 49th for wages.
That's staggering.
Because 30, as I said, 33 is still in the bottom half.
I'm trying to come up, why? Do we know why it's
Well,
like that?
Interestingly
Is it the type
enough,
of jobs we have here that we've attracted?
well, interestingly enough, that 49th is all these numbers that I'm giving you are the rankings that I'm giving you. So the 49th and the 33rd are the rankings that occur after you adjust for what they call regional price parities, which is essentially a cost of living adjustment.
Right.
So they look at the average cost of living for Vermont versus the other states and adjust those rankings accordingly. So if you look at just the raw numbers, before you make that adjustment, that 49th place is actually 23rd.
Oh.
So we are in the top half.
Yeah.
And then when they look at our cost of living
which
and
is,
how far our dollar goes as
Right.
Vermonters, it puts us at the bottom of the
Is
barrel.
that when I was talking about size of companies, I remember when I first moved up here in 91, I think, 91, I was blown away by the fact that a company with 50 employees or more is considered large, big, one of our bigger employers, and that IBM at the time was, I think, 1,800, 2,000 employees, and that was like, that was staggering. And they were the biggest employer. I come from New York, and we have a little different numbers on what we consider to be a small company, a medium-sized company, and a large company.
Well, and what worries me is that this 49th ranking for wages comes at a time when the state of Vermont is desperately trying to attract more people to come here.
Right.
And desperately trying to increase our workforce. I mean, we've talked about this before. Our workforce, and had guests on the show before, our workforce is in a lot of trouble. We've lost 15,000 workers in the last 10 years.
Let me ask you, I'm going to skip in the article if anybody's following along with us, but I'll come back to the other two. You mentioned in the article that, and this is, that the lack of job opportunity is reflected in our too low unemployment rate of 2.3. And the way it was worded was that too low is bad.
So you get to a point.
Why is it bad?
So there is what's considered a healthy unemployment rate. I believe it's somewhere between, it's around 4 to 5% area. So unemployment is often a revolving door where people will be on unemployment and then they'll get a job and then they'll leave. They'll be on unemployment, they'll get a job and then they'll leave. There's a certain percentage of folks that, you know, it is a persistent issue, but for the most part there is a turnover to it. So when you get to a point where jobs are, where unemployment is too low, that ends up in a position where it really eliminates the possibility for folks to move into other positions.
Yeah.
And a big reason why unemployment is so low is because there is a natural, what's considered a natural unemployment rate, a healthy unemployment rate. Believe that it's somewhere around 4.5%, 4 to 4.5% thereabouts. The problem is when you get an unemployment rate that's too low, from an employer's perspective, it means that your candidate pool is very small, that the number of folks that are available to fill positions for you is really low. So if you're an employer and you're thinking of expanding or starting a business in Vermont, you know that you are going to have a very challenging time finding qualified candidates to fill your position. And that's unfortunately kind of the catch-22 that Vermont finds itself in a lot of the times, where people don't want to be here. One of the things we cite in this article is a Burlington Young Professionals Group survey that showed 40% of the respondents said that they had a plan to leave Vermont specifically because they didn't think they could find a job that would help give them financial security. And 45% of those respondents cited job opportunity as their number one concern. But so if you're a company that's looking to expand or grow or start a business here, you're going to be very reluctant because you don't know if you're going to be able to get those folks here. But on the flip side, you also have a situation where people don't want to stay here because those jobs don't exist. So do you stay here hoping the jobs show up, or do you start a company hoping that the employees show up?
And that sets off a stealing sort of thing where you're going after somebody else's employees, and that's very disruptive. Maybe it's good for the employee because they may get more money in the switch, but from an employer perspective, it's always this.
Well, that is the one.
You're always looking for, new hires, and it's just a revolving door.
Well, that is the one upside, is that it does hold the potential to drive, because that kind of piracy does happen.
Yeah, it does.
It does give the option for, it does give the employee a little bit of power to negotiate some higher wages.
Which isn't bad from the employee perspective, but it does set the employer in a little bit of a tailspin, always looking.
Right.
They're always hiring. So in your article, you did talk about, I love this, Vermont is an expensive place to live. We are ranked 49th relative to cost of living. And that's all sectors, right? That's just cost of living in Vermont?
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. And some of the responses that I've gotten to this article is like, well, I mean, it's okay because Vermont has a high quality of life. So I'm happy to pay taxes, higher quality of life. Well, there's a certain truth to that, that Vermont absolutely does have a high quality of life. That's not something that I don't think anybody would argue against. However, that's not an excuse to hide behind. That's not an excuse to shrug off this fairly perilous financial future that we're seeing, because it's great to have a high quality of life, but what's in jeopardy is the ability of the people's ability to enjoy that high quality of life. So, high quality of life, I'm happy to pay taxes. Okay, well, I'm happy that you're privileged enough to be in that position, but make that argument to the thousands of families who are having to make these increasingly difficult decisions on where to allocate their money. Folks who are struggling to feed their family and pay their bills, and are now being told that, well, maybe they're going to have to pay hundreds of dollars a year more for their heating and transportation costs.
Yeah, I heard a number, I'm not going to quote it, but it was staggering about what we're looking at from a cost of living increase based on what our legislators are doing as we speak.
Well, and I know there's more to cover in this article, but I at this point, I'd like to make the point of the message that we're trying to send with this article is that not that any one particular, this isn't pointing a finger at any one particular tax or fee. This isn't an article that's trying to tear down minimum wage increases or speak out against paid family leave. This has nothing to do with that. What this article calls for is a excruciatingly detailed analysis of all spending measures, of all fees, of all increased taxes that don't look at, oh, will this enable us to afford this program that we want to do, but actually looks at, contextualizes that action based on how will it affect the people who are actually going to pay it, and how does this play into our overall future financial solvency as a state. If an action, even if it's something that we really want to do, but the data shows that it's really not something that if we can afford, should we really be doing it?
You and I have talked about this. The legislature does not look at things cumulatively. They look at this issue, this bill, and how much that's going to do, a couple of cents or something. And so they say, well, it's only a couple of cents. And then they go to the next bill, which is only a couple of cents or a couple of dollars. And I think that they should keep a running total like that giant $1 trillion debt clock we have where it keeps running, that you know how much you're going to be hitting people up with the cumulative effect. Because I think you're right. It's not. I mean, how can you say no to some of the things in this state because they're really good stuff? I mean, they're thinking with their heart, and they're passing good bills sometimes, but who can afford it?
Well, and that's exactly right. Where, and I thought that's what appropriations was responsible for, was for looking at numbers like that. But I do think a more, a paradigm shift is needed within the State House that does do exactly that. That doesn't just look at each individual component, but acknowledges that 4 cents on your heating oil here, 30 cents on your gas here, an extra fee here, an extra fee here, that translates into real money for a lot of people.
Well, the sad thing about appropriations is that they are so busy. They stay in their committee most of the time. They don't go on the floor to hear the debates about family leave and hourly wage. So they don't get the flavor of what people are pro or con. They're always in the committee. I always thought that's a committee I would never want to serve on because it's fun to be on the floor and learn about all the other bills. So they don't get that. They don't get that input, which is sad.
And I've seen this a little personal aside. I mean, I've seen this over and over again, where bills are presented and discussed and passed that where the due diligence has not been done to really look at how does this affect the family in Orleans County, or the single mother in Franklin County, or the millennial kids trying to make a go of it in Chittenden County. That's not done nearly enough.
Right.
That full analysis is not done nearly often enough.
I thought each bill was required to have a fiscal note on it, and I don't know whether that's the agency's responsibility or joint fiscal, which is the financial arm of the legislature. But the numbers are there if they've done their homework correctly, and that should be joint fiscal, overseeing how they've done these fiscal notes. It wouldn't be too hard to add them all together because the information is there. You, in this article, you put a number out that I have not seen or heard, and I got me a little worried here. It says the article mentioned that Vermont is now experiencing a net negative worth of $20 million. What is in net worth? What is that encompass, the words net worth?
So our net, essentially, simply put, it's what we owe versus what we have,
Oh,
what we
okay,
bring in.
assets, liabilities,
Yeah,
okay.
it's our overall net worth
Yeah.
as a state.
May I just stop you? Does that include pension liabilities?
So that's exactly what happened. So
Oh, okay.
previous to 2017, and these are numbers that come from David Coates, who's
Yeah,
been on
right,
this,
who's been on the show.
and he's the gentleman who is a registered Democrat, and I say that only because
Well, he's very proud of it,
I
and
know
should
for
be.
sure we're going to get accused of, oh, this is just right-wing fear-mongering.
No,
But
we are.
no, Campaign for Vermont has no political affiliations. We are completely independent. And these are numbers that we're bringing forth that are very important numbers, and they're not coming from a right-wing think tank as we have been accused of doing. But so up in this negative net worth, in truth, has probably existed for a while.
Yeah.
But 2017 was the first year where they were required to take into account and report some of these liabilities
They changed
that
the
we
accounting structure, and I have to remember the name when we talk about this some more. They changed the way you report, and liabilities became part of the reporting process. Right.
Exactly, and now that they are on
Right.
the books,
A little
it's
sobering.
officially on record that we
Right.
have a negative net worth, and it's the first time in
Right.
history that it's been
Now-
officially on the books that way.
And all the things you talked about, the pension and stuff, we were using on our show, and David was using 4.5 billion of liabilities, and that was state, teachers, pension, and healthcare liabilities. So it's all four entities came up with the 4.5 billion. But I haven't heard that mentioned, whether something's changed and how they're looking at that, because David was pretty sure, very
Yeah, so
serious about the 4.5.
So the 4.5 is the combination of the pension, our pension liabilities, and our healthcare
Right.
liabilities.
Right,
So
all together.
a lot of the numbers that I put both of those numbers in here.
Okay.
The 2.3, which is the one that billion, which is the number that's mentioned first, refers to our healthcare liabilities, and these are liabilities that we're obligated to pay, and there's been a long history of underfunding
Yeah.
these payments that's now catching up with us.
The only thing that's less concerning to me on healthcare is that we are self-paying. We don't, as bills come in, we pay it. So it's not like you have to hand somebody, which you might in a pension, have to hand somebody a check for X bucks that you owe them. So that there's a little, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's a little less panic about the healthcare, although it's staggering numbers. So, but it's not. It's the pension part that's more volatile.
So
Is that right? I may be
Well,
completely wrong.
they both should be looked at very carefully.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to refer to some numbers that are here in that articles that refer to the healthcare.
Right.
So right now the healthcare liability is at $2.3 billion. That's a number that increased by $73 million in a year, just 1 year.
Staggering.
10 years ago, that 2.3 billion was, and I use only in quotes here, 487 million. So this is
Piece of cake.
this is something that has
Right.
been, it's a known number that we have to, that we are liable for. Now, David would know the exact mechanisms
Right.
of all of that
Right.
better than I would.
Yeah.
He is an expert in this, and these
Yes,
are
he
his
is.
numbers.
Yep.
I admit I'm not fully versed in the actual mechanism with this, but I know a large concern is that we have a history of not funding the actuarial recommendations
Right.
for this liability, and we have this financial shortfall that's growing and growing, and it's a financial shortfall that's supposed to touch 85 million.
Right.
And
Now,
that's
Beth Pierce does say that she has a plan that she's presented to the union, who should be very concerned about this, and to the legislature, that by 2020, 20-something, it will be much better than what it is, that the gap will have narrowed. But she was originally saying it was 8% return on investment. and I think they lowered it to like 7. I mean, I'm a little small-time investor, and I don't remember getting 7 return on investment on much of anything.
Yeah,
And I think that's very ambitious.
well, and we're recording this right now at
Yeah,
the
today.
time when we have the U.S.-China trade
right.
war
Stock market's
going on.
crashing.
My portfolio dropped
Yeah, right.
11% in one
Yeah,
day.
yeah,
So,
right.
but that has been that is a known issue, and there is a lot of
Yeah.
data showing that what we are as a state predicting our return on these investments to be is significantly higher than what the real
'Cause
numbers actually
there is a
are.
mandatory payment that when you, based on all these numbers, the Fed set a mandatory payment that we have to give into our pension plan
For the pensions,
for the
yes.
pension. And you can't mess with that number. And you've got down here in 2020, this is for healthcare liabilities, 205 million minimum payment for healthcare, and that's right off the top of our revenues. That's before we talk about helping people who need help, before we talk about transportation. Wacko, 205 million right off the top.
And an example that might illustrate why this is a big problem. So this year, it was announced a unexpected $30 million surplus, extra $30 million that popped up. Now, $30 million in the scope of a state budget is not a lot of money. It's a lot of money to you and me.
I could spend it.
In terms of a state budget, it's not really a lot of money. But it's $30 million that could, Vermont has frequently gotten D's and F's in infrastructure studies for the conditions of our bridges.
Right.
$30 million could fix a bridge.
Right.
$30 million could be used to prop up some of our tech centers and help try to funnel more people into technical education.
Right.
$30 million could be used for a lot of really good things.
Right.
But that $30 million immediately was used to help pay off some unfunded debt that we've been underfunding for years and years now.
Right.
And that's going to be the case anytime we get a surplus. I mean, it's
because we have that obligation. You can't come away from it. And Moody's, because they saw the way where we were with our pension, which is one of the rating firms, dropped us only by a half. We had an A, and they dropped us down to A minus. But that's a real red flag.
well,
Because you can't. That impacts everything. It impacts VSAC. It impacts housing. It impacts an awful lot of loan capability for people.
well, and that translates into real money too. Just that little bit
Right?
change
For us, I mean,
was
for the people.
$7 million a year in additional financing
Finance,
charges.
right,
So again, $7 million, not a lot of money in a state budget, but there's a lot of roads that have a lot of potholes in them
Right.
and the transportation fund would love to have money to go put tar into.
Right, exactly. Well, that's why I think we make mistakes in the legislature, because we're sitting there looking at a bill and we're like, well, what's 35 million? Let's vote for it, without, as you were saying before, looking at the big picture and what it means. Maybe we don't quite need it. Sadly, there's a lot of things we do need, and we've let them go. Because I think in transportation, we have a good infrastructure. Let's just fix what we have and move on. But that's another theory, philosophy, I guess. So you were talking about retirement, speaking of me. Let's talk me. That this has been categorized as one of the worst places to retire anywhere. And what's the solution to that? There isn't any.
Well, so concurrent to Vermont's workforce shrinking and creating these labor pool issues that we're having, Vermont's population is aging substantially. And there was a report, and these are some of the numbers that the state's own numbers that we cite.
Right.
There was a report to Joint Fiscal Office waving a red flag, saying that significant portions of the state's tax revenue comes from the baby boomer generation. And as these folks are moving out of the workforce and moving out of creating that tax revenue, they're not being replaced. So you have a lot of folks who are paying into the tax system,
Right.
who are then going to be leaving the tax system. They'll still be paying taxes, but not as much, and they're not going to be paying in as much. So that is going to depress the state's ability to earn these tax revenues. So on top of that, because of the way we do tax them, Vermont was listed as the worst place to retire from taxes. And, you know, this goes to the point where, like, sure, it's pretty, sure, it's got a high quality of life, and the lake is fun to look at when there's not, you know, cyanobacteria blooms. But people are going to have that inner dialogue or discuss with their partner, is it worth staying here if we know that our fixed income is it's gonna really cut us close to the bone here? So our policies are discouraging the folks who are retiring from staying here, which could even further jeopardize our ability to earn the taxes we need to pay the bills. So you essentially end up with a situation where you have fewer people shouldering the load of higher liabilities and working for some of the lowest wages in the country. That's not a recipe for success.
Right. Well, when you think about it, they raised the retirement age. So that means older people are staying longer, and they're not opening up new jobs for younger people to come in and you know, move up the ladder, because we have to work longer, and that's bad PR. That we are and I think they tried with the Social Security with not taking taxes out of our Social Security was a big step. That was just for a certain category of taxpayers, but that was a lot of states have that, where if you, Pennsylvania, I think they don't charge any government pension that doesn't get charged taxes, or Social Security. Sign me up. It's a great thing, but we just started that this year, so we at least took one step in the right direction.
Well, and I will say that. I don't want to make it sound like I'm up here screaming at doom and gloom at the skies. There has been some discussion that's going on about this. I think this is the first time where we've seen the numbers so starkly.
Yes.
And we have been contacted. I've been accused of being unfair, that these numbers are unfair to the state. And that we're being too negative, and we're discouraging people from moving here. And there are people who don't want to know the truth and are very uncomfortable with the truth about this. But it has been talked about. It is a conversation that is happening, not quite as prominently as I would like to see.
Right.
I know in his inaugural address, in his budget address, the governor did specifically mention our indebtedness and our liability, and the importance of trying to come up with a plan to address this. There are steps being taken to try to increase our workforce, the size of our workforce. We have seen some steps, although it's more of a fizzle than a flame, to increase participation in workforce training and technical education, and create some opportunities for Vermonters within the state.
We have 17 minutes, so we have a little time to sneak this conversation in. They had a workforce development bill, which we were following, H533.
533, yes.
Went over to the Senate. Senate didn't like what the House did. Oh, then it went to conference committee, and now it's like.
So there was
a
version, there was a version that the House put together, which was, it was okay.
Yeah,
it was
I thought
okay.
It was fine.
The Senate changed quite a bit on it, and it lost a little bit of its teeth in that process.
Right.
It was brought to the floor at the end of last week, and the House refused the Senate's amendments.
Right.
And so they've called it into a conference.
But then the conference committee couldn't come to any agreement, so they've called for another conference committee.
Well, I think you're getting that
What is
confused
that?
with the H39, the forced mergers, because that's what's happened with the forced mergers, where they had a conference committee, and then the House decided after playing ball, they just decided they weren't going to play ball anymore,
so they walked
and
away.
then everybody was butting
That's
heads,
right,
so
'cause-
they dissolved it. That's a whole episode in
And I wrote
itself.
something back to them about why are you dumping on the heads of our school boards, because they're just regular people volunteering their time. They've got families and jobs, and you're making it pretty hard for them.
Well,
So-
what was really interesting about that is that doesn't make any sense, that the whole situation's not grounded in reality, where
No.
the House almost, by 5 votes, did not pass, almost passed a version
get
of
'em
the
on.
H39 bill that was extremely similar
Right.
to the version passed by the Senate. So that sends the message that most people in the House
Like what they did.
support the Senate version.
Right.
But you have 3 people on this conference committee who decided that, well, they don't like the Senate version, so they're just going to stop the whole process.
Welcome to
And
Montpelier.
and they're trying to compromise completely outside of the bounds of reality, where they have, if you're negotiating and the terms are somewhere between 10 and 20, you don't counter with 1. So, anyways, I'm sorry,
Anyway,
that's
no,
a
I
tangent.
said I was watching the clock, because I had breakfast this morning with somebody who's been very involved in all of this, and he's adamant that they don't need a year, that they've had since 2015. But I don't think people took it very seriously, and so here we are.
Well, Act 46 has been around. The school board's forced merger process
Right.
has not been around for that long.
Right, no.
But
A few things that happened, but anyway, so I apologize for mixing them up. For workforce development, I was very upset to hear that sort of run into a roadblock, because we've been supporting technical education here, and I've been supporting them adding in people with disabilities. You want to talk about a strong workforce who wants to work and just needs a little help, but they're not doing it. I don't understand them. But anyway, and then they wonder why, it says here, our workforce has shrunk by 15,000 workers. It's by. They're going. They're gone.
and Pat, I'd like to just use this moment to address some of the comments that we've been getting on
Sure.
our Facebook page frequently, and it's really almost disheartening in a way. Some of the reaction that we've been having to this is the number of people who would rather just immediately assume they know what they're talking about, and not actually look at the facts and not look at the data, and present these pointed fingers at people that are just, some of them are just hateful. That sounds like I'm
That's
being
where we are
dramatic,
these
but
days.
I'm really not. I've had
Yep.
to delete and moderate numerous comments that are just been very, very hateful. And the most common one that I want to address, because I've been seeing it on and on and on, is that the reason Vermont is having financial problems is because of, and these are not my words, I'm just to quote one of the
Do
posts,
not beat up on the messenger.
quote, lazy poor people.
Oh, right.
And I called one person out on our Facebook page because she said, oh, it's, I know 2 people in the city of Newport who brag about cheating the system. And I said, okay, so sure. Yes, there will always be thieves. There will always be stealers. There are always thieves, cheaters, liars. That's just the way the world works.
Right.
But because you know a thief, do you assume that everybody that looks like that person is a thief? Or everybody in a similar situation is a thief? So 2 people who cheat the system.
Right.
Okay, they're the bad apples. But that should not by any means give you any reason to think that people who rely on social services,
Right.
that's representative of the people who rely on
She
social
comes sit
services.
at a board meeting at Prevent Child Abuse Vermont. We'll tell them.
And I called her out and I said, what you're showing right now is absolute bias.
Right.
It's classism, it's bias. You are looking at 2 people of a certain circumstance and assuming
you.
that the entirety of that population that associates with that circumstance
Right.
has to act like these 2 because 2 people.
Right.
That's the definition of
Bias.
bias.
Right.
And it's that kind of attitude that has been popping up over and over again, and that doesn't help move the conversation anywhere. That doesn't
But
help.
That's really what's happening. People are just so angry, and they're unhappy themselves. And God forbid they see somebody who's better off than they are. They're mad or jealous or whatever the words are. And it's really, nobody compromises, nobody can even talk, and I'm saying nobody like it's a general thing. A lot of people can't even talk civilly anymore about arguing and debating back and forth. What's wrong with that?
And yeah, and I just, there's so, and we can have a guest on that can talk about this and explain this in more detail, but there are so many different reasons why people are on unemployment. Family
Right, for sure.
situations, family emergencies, illness, sickness, they're taking care of a kid, of a loved one, that to assume that just because you're currently part of that 2.3%, that you're doing it because you're lazy and you want free money, that's
wrong.
don't fall for that. Don't challenge yourself to think beyond that narrow scope.
Because when I was on the Central Vermont Home Health and Hospice Board, I had the privilege of going with one of the nurses out to visit clients. And one of the clients was in a very bad situation financially. One of the other clients was in a very nice house, big house, nice, the whole thing was lovely, the house. But when I went into behind the door, what they were dealing with as a family would just tear your heart out.
Well,
I mean, it was horrible. So you don't know when you're looking at a door or a house or living conditions, what's really behind that door. You've got to give people a little break here.
And you don't know who it is either. I've worked for COTS, I've worked with Habitat for Humanity,
Right.
I've worked with Meals on Wheels, and you see people who they don't look any different than you or
Right,
I, and you would never know that there are people who needed. So to generalize and try to marginalize a population and just place blame on a population that you know nothing about is just
when you don't know, zip it up.
and so this and this goes to a larger point of we need to, this goes almost back to the original point, where anytime we do one of these, the paradigm shift that I asked for before, of looking at not things just through your own scope of we need to have this program or we need to do this spending, or not just, don't look through things through that, don't just look through things through your own scope. Allow yourself to look at outside of that field and ask yourself, how is this truly going to affect the people of Vermont and the financial situation of Vermont?
And that's the recommendation that this article gives, that you're giving, we're giving, is to be transparent and really think about what does the data say.
Right.
Because I know the data point that drives me crazy is in Vermont, 1 out of every 4 people deal with food insufficiency. And I'm like, but when you think about it, the guy with the McMansion, if he's having really serious financial troubles, you have to pay the rent, you have to pay pay the mortgage, the electric bill, blah, blah, blah. The one thing you have control over buying is food. And that's the first thing that gets cut back.
Well, and I'd like
there
to
you
think
go.
that's the case too for a lot of the middle class in Vermont, and really nationally at this point, where you have these folks that they are working and they are making money. They don't qualify for some of these social.
That's right, I love that.
But you'll see, where I used to work was right next to one of the food pantries,
Right.
and if you're at that point and if you're having a tough month and your car needs an unexpected repair, or there's so many people. I just saw a stat today. It was 73% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck.
Yep.
That means if you blow a tire or your transmission falls out of your
messed.
vehicle.
That's it. Yeah, and the food goes, because that's the easiest thing not to buy.
Right.
So I think and people that I know in the food pantry sort of area, they say you would be surprised who comes in, after work with the suits, and it's not who you think sometimes. So this has been picked up by several papers, and it's out there, and it's been shared. As I said before, it's been shared all over the place. So we've sort of hit a nerve.
Yeah, and I think it's something, as I said, that we really need to look at as just as important of an issue, even though it's not as hot
not so sexy.
Not so sexy as some of these things going on. But we really need to look at this, especially if you're a family that's deciding whether or not you wanted to move to Vermont. And I
Right.
actually heard from somebody that contacted me and said, "Hey, my family and I were going to move to Vermont, but we just told our realtor to stop looking because of your article." Now, I
Whoa.
didn't, like, my goal
Yeah.
isn't to discourage
Right.
that.
Stick-
My goal
help
is to
us.
put the truth of the situation out there, because until you know the truth about a situation,
Right.
you can't really and truly address it.
Right.
So my goal isn't to discourage this, people from coming to Vermont, but we need to know this truth, and that's a perfect example of, if we are trying to solve some of these problems, why would somebody come here when they know that they're going to get, their
Right.
wages are 49th out of the
Right.
out of the state, or out of the
Well, they
nation?
can't argue with the numbers, and those are key issues: wages, health care, jobs, cost of living. That's what every legislator has heard when they go out on the campaign trail. What's the big issues for you? And then they go back to the legislature, and we eliminate plastic bags. Very good. So,
And I mean, those, some of that stuff, I mean, it's important to do for sure.
Absolutely, I
And
understand.
it does help. But, and this, again, kind of goes into my personal just frustrations where, I live in Burlington, and like I said, I've worked with the homeless population there, and I live in the north end of Burlington, so every day I see a population of Burlington that a lot of people don't want to admit exists.
Yeah.
So when I hear people, and I'm going to make people mad when I say this, I don't care, but when I see the amount of energy and money and time people spend in protesting them cutting down trees in City Hall Park that are already dying,
right,
if people spent half as much energy
right.
on dealing with some of these real foundational problems, we would be so much better off. But it's a lot easier to protest a tree cutting down
Sure.
than trying to
Yep.
figure out how to stop chronic homelessness.
Right.
So you
Well, and it's something
protest
you
your
can say
tree,
you
you go
did,
home, you
right.
pat yourself on your
Right.
back, but guess what? That guy is still sleeping outside tonight.
Yeah, right.
So it's that same message that to me translates frequently when I see how we're spending our time in the State House, where, yeah, some of the stuff it's good to do, and maybe it's fun, but
Yep.
how does that, and good, you can say that
Right.
you during your term in office you accomplished this, but what does that, how does that help us 20 years
Yeah,
down
and
the road?
I totally, just before anybody yells at me, I totally understand the plastic bag deal.
Yeah.
And I understand what it does to our waterways and all that stuff. And I'm glad it got passed, but it should have gotten passed as something to do in between passing economic development or workforce development. When there was a little lull, they could have had a good conversation about plastic.
And,
But
yeah.
it shouldn't have been the main focus for a week or two.
And that's
really.
it's one that I support as a
Oh, yeah,
bill that
I
I
do.
support as well. But like you said, why, is it really a priority
Right.
over,
Not some of these other
making
things.
sure we're not
'Cause
49th in the state
we
for
just keep,
wages?
what is it, pushing the can down that's all we do in this state, every 2 years, which gets into the should it be 4 years, but I'm for that, because usually you're running and thanking, and running and thanking, and running and thanking, when if you had 4 years, you'd have 2 years in between to actually do something, and you wouldn't have to, worry about because they only remember what you've done the last, which is true, the last couple of months, so. Anyway, so we have 2 minutes left. Do you want to wrap this up and talk about, maybe summarize what we've heard today and get those legislators to
Yeah,
pay
so
attention?
because we've thrown a lot of numbers out. So if I had to give this as like a 2-minute elevator pitch,
Right.
is Vermont's in trouble, prosperity is in jeopardy.
Right.
There's data that shows that for the first time ever, the current generation of Vermonters will have fewer opportunities for prosperity than the generation before it. We're facing this new data that shows that after you adjust for cost of living, we are 49th in the nation for our total compensation being the total of our wages and our benefits. On top of that, we have a workforce that has shrunk by 15,000 in the last 10 years. We have a population that is aging out of the active tax revenue.
Right.
And on top of that, we have policies that are convincing people not to stay here after they retire, which furthermore depresses our ability to have consistent tax revenue. And the numbers are, it's not anecdotal. That study out of Burlington Young Professionals, 40% of people.
Yeah, talk a little bit about that. Who is that group? They're
So
young
it's a
working
group,
people? Or?
So it's a group of working professionals in all sectors
Yeah.
under the age of 40.
Oh.
And it's a program of the Lake Champlain Regional Chamber of Commerce.
Oh, nice.
Full disclosure, I did used to be one of their board committee members there.
Is that like the
And-
BNI here in this area? I think.
No, it's a working group within the Chamber of Commerce
Oh,
that talks
oh,
about
it's
some of the
reported?
issues. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It talks about some of the issues facing young professionals in the
Great.
Vermont workforce.
Great.
But they put out this
They wanna
study,
go.
and 40% of the respondents said, "Yeah, I'm strongly considering leaving Vermont because I don't see this as a place where I could build a strong financial future."
Wow, that's a statement. I hope they get that around.
And
These
if
are
that's
young people.
and if that's the number in Chittenden County, which is generally has the out of the places that have shrunk whose workforces have shrunk, Chittenden County
Yep,
tends
right.
to avoid a lot of those changes. They've still shrunk, not as much as say Orleans County, which has dropped almost to by
Yep,
20%.
Yep.
So if that's the case in Chittenden County, that's going to be the case anywhere. So.
Scary.
Yeah, shrinking workforce, unsustainable liabilities.
We have to go. See what happens when you're a guest and you keep talking? Thank you very much, Eric.
Yes, thank you.
This was great. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week. In the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.